So thank you so much for coming. This contribution today focuses on the earliest attestations of writing on Crete, dating to the Middle Minoan period, at the transition between the pre-Palatial and the proto-Palatial period. We are at the beginning of the second millennium BC, and our focus are some locations such as the Palace of KNOSSOS, MALIA, and especially a cemetery site called ARCHANES-PHOURNOI, very close to KNOSSOS. The writing in question is represented by the so-called ARCHANES script found at the cemetery of ARCHANES-PHOURNOI, and by a number of engraved multi-sided seal stones bearing Cretan hieroglyphic signs. These inscriptions will also be correlated to the evidence provided by the texts inscribed on clay documents in a more cursive type of Cretan hieroglyphic that you can see on the right of the slide. The aim is to propose a new interpretation for the origin of writing on the island, investigate the context for its creation, and explore the cultural triggers that underline the application of writing in Middle Minoan Crete. As a corollary, comparative evidence drawn from other civilizations and a formal relationship with other cultural discourses, such as art and iconography, will be appraised to gain a synoptic understanding of origin, purpose, experience, and perception of the earliest attestations of writing on the island. So a lot of stuff to talk about. Writing was once defined as an immense, tangled, obscure topic, a daunting, not simply defined entity. The possible perspectives from which it can be approached are endless. But there are also some problems. Written objects have become the preserve of archaeologists and treated as elements of specific sets of material culture. And written language has become the preserve of linguists, who interpret texts in terms often autonomous from the cultural setting that produces them. Therefore, the phenomenon of writing has, I think, suffered from an artificial epistemological separation, a great divide of methodology and intents, opposing archaeology with linguistics. This is especially relevant for the study of ancient writing in the Aegean Bronze Age, and there are some other complications there. These complications are, to put it very briefly, two: the paucity of the material recovered and the undeciphered status of the scripts in question. Also, the subject has suffered from a radical positivism that has produced cautious or resigned stances that paraphrase and belie the same unwavering position. This is where the evidence ends. The archaeologist grapples with the poverty of the evidence, and the linguist is forced to a deafening silence. The truth is that at present, Aegean archaeologists and philologists are still at the beginning when it comes to the beginnings of writing, and the questions of how and why scripts emerged on Crete are still suspended and brushed off as unsolvable conundrums. So I feel forced today to posit three very, very basic questions to show you how little progress I think has been made. One, is incipient writing on Crete actual writing? Two, how was it first used? And three, what are its origins and significance? I need to put some theory into the discourse. There is a tendency to see the activity of writing as a purely linguistic phenomenon, as visible speech. In the most exclusionary terms of this view, pictography or picture writing or semasiography, as you want to call it, is completely abolished. Is this to be accepted? For instance, neither music nor mathematics can be conveyed through the means of speech, but they still constitute writing systems as they require verbalization to occur in order to be understood. And this is not language specific. We can decipher the signs on the left-hand side of the slide in any language. Speech, in other words, in this process of verbalization, always sneaks in by the back door. Some scholars have, I think rightly, advocated that the definition of writing needs to be expanded to go beyond the idea that only with phonological graphemes, with signs that record language, can we unambiguously identify languages. So exploring the possibilities of the ambiguous, stretching the semantic range of writing and shortening the distance between writing and non-writing, icons and signs, should not be useless, and it can be quite good fun. Writing and images can function in similar ways, conveying a message together in a coherent unison. Maybe we shouldn't stretch this as far as to translate a novel like Les Miserables into emoticons, as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide. So this idea of stretching the boundaries is particularly important for scripts that have not been deciphered, because knowledge about them and their internal structure may be inaccessible. So all accompanying features, be they iconographic or not, may elucidate the role of that script assumes in a particular context. The earliest attestations of Cretan hieroglyphic seals fit into this broad picture quite well, as we shall see in a moment. Cretan hieroglyphic was defined by Evans, when he dug out KNOSSOS, as a pictographic script as soon as he found the seals in 1909. This quality, this pictographic quality, he claimed is most evident in the signs engraved on the multi-sided seal stones or stamped on ceilings, rather than the ones used on clay documents found on bars, tablets, medallions, etc., for administrative purposes, where signs are naturally more stylized and linear, being they drawn on clay, in harmony with all the other documents written with the other Aegean scripts. For these economic texts, Arthur Evans and Jean-Pierre Olivier after him recognized a distinct set of signs, which indicated that the script in question has a syllabic structure. The signs record syllables. Actually, the proper definition for this repertoire is logosyllabary, because more than 30 logograms, signs that record words, are attested, which, to complicate matters further, can be found in the double function of logogram and syllabogram. So a third of the total repertoire, in other words, is logosyllabographic. Whatever, these are technicalities. What is important is that the script is not pictographic in the strictest sense, but has a phonological structure, at least on the clay documents. Cretan hieroglyphic is naturalistic in its overall appearance, but mind not so realistic in the most figurative sense. As you can see, the script is at an already well-defined stage of stylization and abstraction. Even the signs that can be singled out as logograms inscribed on clay, as attested in the administrative documents, have an essentially stylized appearance. But how about the signs on the seal stones? Do they represent actual writing? There's been a lot of reluctance to accept this. Olivier, who produced the first corpus of Cretan hieroglyphic in 1996, claimed that there are no rules to determine what is writing and what is not, because this is not writing stricto sensu, this is not real writing, but ornamental writing. Is he right? Well, he's right in claiming that it is difficult to determine what elements represent ornamentation versus what elements point to real writing, as the combination of the two tends to fill the space available on the surface in no neat patterns. Elements can be reduplicated, embellished, often in no defined order. This effect panders to a very special Minoan horror vacui, a fear of the void, which often entangles signs with ornaments and fillers, with the result that the boundaries between them are very blurred. To give you an example, and show you that the overall effect is one where the disjunction in terms of style between iconography and possible syllabograms is often so fluid that it can be assumed that writing and art are part of the same ensemble. The representation and sign sequences are actually meant to converge in one unique message. You can see this in the examples that bear the same two sign sequence on the slide, but are embedded in different iconography and style. Each of them is unique. So what are we to make of the relationship between all these elements? Can Cretan hieroglyphic on seal stones pass, as has been suggested, for arbitrary groupings of decorative signs or strings of logographs combined together to express a specific thought process, but which do not represent speech? Is there truth in the claim that we do not have coherent sequences, but a series of, and I'm quoting, typical hieroglyphic pirouettes, whatever that means, with signs changing their positions and alternating in ways that hardly seem phonetic, whatever that means? Does this mean that phoneticism is not represented at all on the seal stones? Well, there are clues that point to Cretan hieroglyphic actually being glottographic, meaning that linguistic notation was actually recorded. One such clue resides in the fact that some formulas are attested both in the administrative documents and on the seals, and these sequences, albeit very few, appear quite frequently in both the corpus of the administrative documents and the seal stones. Their presence in the archival administrative documents could partly legitimate the status as phonographs, as signs that record sounds, on the seals as well. But this is dependent on what the actual formulas meant on the archival documents in the first place. To understand this, the orders should be studied more in depth, seeking possible patterns of coherence in the orientation of the signs on the seal stones, and in such a small corpus, the endeavor is quite stunted, but not impossible. Also, elements that cannot be represented at the graphemic level, at the level of recording sounds, should be analyzed better, namely signs that indicate ordering of information, like punctuation, marks that denote the end of phrases or division of paragraphs. We have, for instance, and you can see it on the slide, consistent evidence for the reading direction being indicated by the cross sign. Similar clues can only indicate that the expectation was for a close reading practice. However, there is a possibility that the painstaking endeavor of seeking patterns of repetition, of charting coherent arrangements, engaging a predictable rationale to prove linguistic coding, falls actually short of appreciating the message conveyed by the seal stones in their entirety. The nature of the evidence and the sequences of signs, the words on the signs, already prompt to claim that there is no developed syntax, there is no syntactical complexity in the Cretan hieroglyphic system that we can speak of, be it on the sequences on seal stones or those on the clay tablets or bars or medallions. Writing is never continuous, and inscriptions are always indexical, self-contained in the space of a seal face or a medallion. Words are characterized by a pattern of itemization, as lists on inventory records, and on seal stones, the sequences are marked by a strong tendency to be formulaic. See, for instance, the 8-sided prism from Neapolis on Crete, where each side has a separate, self-contained formula. So Cretan hieroglyphic offered an extremely limited instrument which cut short the opportunity to express continued narrative and full syntax. This is to be expected, as it is the case in most instances of the earliest stages of any writing system. So the issue of whether phoneticism existed or not, whether lexical information was conveyed or not, misses, I think, the point of establishing parameters to define if Cretan hieroglyphic represents actual writing, especially if we accept, as advocated above, and not just by me, that a broad definition of writing should be embraced. In other words, the writing on these objects is only one ingredient, and the focus should shift to the message on the seal stones as a whole. This implies a meaning carried by the entirety of each individual seal, the iconography indicating naturally its essential iconicity, and the lexemes, the words, working in synergy. At times they amalgamate to the extent that spelling out the individual components is very difficult. In this light, I think the function is essentially iconic, as semasiographic noting is as picture writing. Writing and non-writing are all part of the same multimodality and possibly part of the same perception, equalizing their capacity to be inherently representative. So whatever the precise definition to be attached to the Cretan hieroglyphic as we find it on the seals, the specific statement that was being made in the act of impressing a message is significant in itself, beyond writing, and represents in the confines of a seal face the totality of the encapsulated message. This is not uncommon in the earlier stages of literacy in other traditions. As is the case for the earliest Egyptian writing, syntax was offered by the object itself and the meaning was associative. There should be a slide on that. There it is. And the meaning was associative. The message is wholly context dependent. And at this stage of development, systematic phonography may not have been the goal at all. Crucially, it's equally possible that in a similar way to the early Maya system in Mesoamerica, only for noting proper names, and I stress this, proper names, was a link established between signs and the specificity of language. The way that the message encapsulated on the seal stones was perceived on Crete is another issue to which we will presently turn. The question of perception deserves some attention. What was the expected effect that these messages were meant to induce? Can we calibrate a definition of reading as a response to the definition of writing sought out above? Unraveling these questions is particularly difficult. If literacy is limited to entailing a direct link between language and script, the short reply is very negative. The earliest Cretan writing cannot tell us anything about the former, namely language, and is arguably very underrepresentative of the latter, script. If, however, we assume that literacy refers to a more punctuated and flexible relationship between production of writing and the very varied responses to it, then we can negotiate on what the earliest attestations of Cretan writing may have meant. An often neglected aspect to explain this is that writing may have had a visual impact rather than a documentary one, and that inscriptions may have been understood aside of what was written on them. Coming into contact with such objects and not reading them may have been the most common experience that people had of writing. It may be possible that too much emphasis has been placed on the reception of writing as significant only if the encoded message is fully and exhaustively decoded. It is conversely possible that the effect would not have been dissimilar to take care of the sense and the sounds will take care of themselves. This slant is influenced by the ways in which modern studies of literacy appraised reading and writing in the ancient world. For a long time, literacy has been framed in technical terms, and writing considered a technology of the intellect capable of predictable cognitive progress. Instead, all uses of writing are located in a particular time and place, and their effects are totally unpredictable. On the other side of the equation, people's reactions to them can vary, and their understanding of writing can differ as widely. Even the illiterate interacted and reacted to text. Also, and this happens still today, power dynamics are made to play a very big role in understanding how writing was used in the past. the definition of power may be deceptive, especially in light of the insistence on seeing it as a propulsive force that compels through the agency of a top-down authority. Power is often made to be the power of boroughs, states, and empires, and writing its physical representation in the form of the all-engulfing central archive. However, even in the most bureaucratic of states, such as the Mesopotamian or the Roman, writing did not manifest itself only as a technology of power, but it was also used in a more personal fashion, empowering individuals rather than central authorities. So I think that perhaps more nuanced terms should be adopted, more contingent with the way the written word can interact with people, both illiterate and literate, to produce quite different effects. Perhaps the microscopic dimensions of writing, small, intimate, everyday dimensions, should be emphasized. The stuff out of which senses of identity, senses of self as a private individual as well as a social entity are composed and recomposed. The earliest seal stones on Crete were significant as phlogistic devices. They were essentially used for sealing purposes. Under this broad use lurk other purposes, namely to control, guarantee, authorize, or label. However, it would be dismissive to see their significance end in the purely administrative function. Seals serve as items of personal status. As we shall see, the likelihood is that the impetus for script creation on Crete was not linked to any form of administration, and its significance was not economic, but symbolic. The cemetery of Phournois at Archanes is one of the most important cemeteries in the Aegean, in use from the beginning to the end of the Bronze Age. In the transitional phase, at the very end of the pre-palatial period, a new type of seal makes its appearance at the site, engraved with signs belonging to a script named ARCHANES. The corpus is very small, as it comprises 4 to 7 seal stones. I don't know why that crept in. This microcorpus has been separated from Cretan hieroglyphic and singled out as the Archanes script because it records the same 5-sign formula and belongs to a slightly earlier period. This ascription to a self-contained writing system is probably only a question of terminology, and I'm not really happy with that. And I think it's most likely very artificial and uneconomical, as the formula also reappears later in linear A as the very famous Asa Sarame libation formula, taken to be a religious dedication. It must be noted that these attestations may not correspond to the beginning of writing. They're simply the earliest that we can observe. What can be inferred about them is that these seal stones appear to be associated with particular groups, clans, or families who buried their dead in the buildings at the cemetery and were possibly related to each other in some way. The particular character of the seals defines a specific relationship with the owner, pointing not only to his identity, but also to his status. Seal stones, whether inscribed with writing or not, were not only prestige items, but personal ones, buried with their owners, each of them unique in iconography and motif. And also, in these early instances, they were found before and outside the establishment of a palace bureaucracy as instances of personal conspicuous consumption. But what is the ultimate message? If we look closely at the most intricate specimen, a rod with 14 seal faces, we gain some insight as to the use and significance of these objects. Each side of the rod has 3 seal surfaces. The hieroglyphic inscription involves only 2 faces on one side, and you find it circled in red, as it is doubtful whether the third phase of the side in question is inscribed or not. Another side seems to have two individual hieroglyphic signs in isolation, and you find it circled in blue. The other sides have only iconographic details. In the act of stamping with this object, each side has to be used as a unit, so that the message was carried not just with writing only, but in tandem with other iconographic elements as well. The quality is therefore highly emblematic and goes beyond the understanding of a phonologically significant correspondence with the hieroglyphic sets of signs. Moreover, on two other three-side prisms from ARCHANES, the formula is split across the sides, and the inscription is interrupted, as it were, so that only a three-step process of impressing would make sense. There is no instance of sealings stamped 3 times, so the likelihood is that this type of object makes sense in its three-dimensional quality as a physical object to be worn and displayed. Also, the sequences on all seal stones are highly repetitive. This frames the question of the accessibility of these objects, which indicates that the sequences are very recognizable, more than they would be if they were highly variable. In cognitive psychology, word recognition often bypasses phonological coding and goes straight to the lexical item directly. It follows that if we're faced with individual words, we will recognize them without reading them, with little phonological effort. Yet each of these specimens does not at any level conform to a stylistically normalized set of rules. Each hieroglyphic inscription is individually wrapped up in its very special seal package. Each represents an attempt at a very individualized manipulation of a system of communication. Writing is not so much a technology but a symbol in itself, probably as much linked to display as it was to a formally utilitarian application in the administration. This is what has been called the symbolic salience of writing, which is tied to the knowledge on the part of the receivers that writing was actually present and that it was meaningful, an ingredient in the complexity of a high visual culture. But what do these inscriptions actually say? The phragistic usage of the seals, the act of stamping with them to authenticate documents and securing property, might give clues as to the nature of the inscriptions on the seals. But can we get any closer to their ultimate function through an analysis of the sign sequences, an analysis of the words that are attested? There are two striking aspects related to the occurrence of words on the seal stones. First, the high instance for 3 or 4-sided prisms that bear one or more sides engraved with hieroglyphic signs. And second, the fact that these words are often repeated so as to constitute proper formulas. 8 separate formulas have been observed. Amongst these, 2 are very frequent. Formula number 1, which you can see on the slide, appearing 70 times, and formula number 2 appearing about 30 times. Overall, a third of the seal inscriptions records one of these 2 formulas. Olivier, who's the only one that has dealt with interpreting the sequences, sees a possible meaning of the 2 most frequent formulas in reference to the palace and the temple institutions. But this is where his interpretation ends. Before this suggestion, Evans had already proposed that the sequences may represent official titles. He went so far as to advance a possible hypothesis of the significance of a series of signs that recur in formulas, which does not seem to be language-bound, so that the actual individual signs are to be interpreted as pictures, as semasiographic. This way we get things like the keeper of the swine, and I'm not joking about that, he actually interpreted it that way, and some such unlikely interpretations I'm so sorry, but poor Evans. All of this aside, what is to be evinced from such inferences is that he assumed that the rebus principle was in action, at least as far as the repeated formulas are concerned. So, what are the sequences telling us, moving beyond what Evans thought? I've already given it away with that title, What's in a Name, but let me explain. The pattern of repetition, the formulas, may be significant in themselves and may represent institutional designations in the way that have been interpreted in the past, palace or temple, it doesn't matter. But what may be of interest, or what is at least of interest to me, is to compare what is repeated, the formulas, against what is not repeated, and come to a complementary understanding of the sign sequences of the words, of the seals and sealings that are not part of the formulaic repertoire. Can the single occurrences, the so-called, I've called them HAPAX legomena, in the repertoire, as it were, shed some light on the interpretation of the subject matter? Well, first we need to separate the corpus of sealings from that of the engraved seal stones. Out of a total number of 280 individual sign sequences, we only have 280 words in the corpus of Cretan hieroglyphic on the seals. More than half of the sequences are represented by a formula. So half of the repertoire is represented by repeated attestations. Of the sealings repertoire, out of a total number of 57 sequences, almost half has a formula. So both the sequences on seals and those on the sealings are roughly balanced in representing repetition, in representing the formulas. The remainder of the sequences is therefore not repeated. It is remarkable that half of these single occurrences, these HAPAX legomena, are found specifically on one-sided seal stones. This means that the function of these particular one-sided seals was to have that particular non-repeated sequence engraved only and uniquely there. This works also for those 3 or 4-sided seals that you can see on the slide that have only one side engraved with a sequence that is not repeated elsewhere, the single attestations. These unique words are, to put it briefly, not associated with a formula, even though the space to add it would have been available. Instead of having a formula, we have geometric motifs, or animals, or even a maiden with a flowing mane, which are represented on the other faces of the seal, and these are circled in red. So where we would have expected a formula, we get all these feeling motifs. To summarize this in a nutshell, we can observe sequences that are unique attestations, more often than not isolated, as much as we have sequences that are repeated to a high degree of formulaic structure, often in association with uniquely attested sequences. What do we make of this? From a macro perspective, if we look at the actual appearance of the inscriptions and not at the neat normalized transcriptions in the corpus, we get a sense of how individualized the signs are. They don't adhere to any particular stylistic repertoire or detail. They have no element repeated or standardized within a template. These objects, all beads serving the same function, are not only far from having been serially produced, but they are individually personalized. The details in the engravings of the sequences of the words are custom-made. They're tailored to alternating degrees of embellishment. What lexical elements, what subject matters can dictate such willful intention to personalize? There's been, in the past, a certain tendency to shy away from possible interpretations of what Cretan hieroglyphic records before a proper decipherment. Assuming that these non-repeated sequences, the single attestations, the HAPAX legomena, can represent personal names, would no doubt constitute such assumption, one such assumption, but I don't think it's any less tantalizing for its speculative nature. The fact that the repeated words can correspond to institutional realms, the formulas may constitute institutional realms in the administration, be they temple or bureaucracy, would not impinge on such a reading. The association of a single attestation to a repeated formula would point to a closer rendering of the role of a spelled-out individual in the institution or realm of activity by the formula itself, together with the personal name. Equally, the single attestations that are not associated with any formula, be they represented by a single sequence on one-sided seals, standing out in splendid solitude, or found spread out on four-sided seals in longer sequences, may indicate simple personal names or personal names with other designations added. In brief, these sequences need not be signatures in all instances, but their inherent reason to exist would be to specify people, both in their individuality and in their institutional role. Comparative evidence for texts being nominal or titular in the earlier stages of writing, or even before, abounds. In pre-writing or proto-writing phases, the encoding of proper personal names appears to have been a very important step of development of writing. Proper names are indexical in function, they pick out individuals, but do not have any contextual elements that define them better. They stand in isolation with no syntax, with no syntactical specification. This is, for instance, the earliest unambiguous evidence for writing in Mesoamerica, with one exception. If all of this is correct, the much glorified idea that a decipherment of Cretan hieroglyphic will solve our problems will in fact complicate the picture to even more frustrating degrees. Finding out that exactly half of the words in the corpus represents morphologically insignificant segments, like names, that hardly help in identifying language affiliation or in reconstructing internal structure, would constitute the ultimate academic irony for all would be decipherers, and have fun with that. It's a bit like Etruscan in a way. All this helps to frame a definition of Cretan writing, its perception and use as a tool within Cretan society, but does not explain how and why this writing system gets to be created. This last section seeks to explore the possible origin and cultural triggers that allowed Cretan hieroglyphic to come into being, and I'm delving into the intricacies of a theoretical adventure. There hasn't been enough debate on the origin of the earliest Cretan writing, starting from Evans's palographic analysis of possible sign correspondences that link it with Egyptian hieroglyphic, whose similarity, in his view, is taken to be so evident as to justify the borrowing of the name hieroglyphic itself. The view that writing could have had a different origin has not been entertained at all, no doubt for reasons of empirical caution, which clearly I don't have. Moreover, the background to writing on Crete goes side by side with the source responsible for the emergence of the seal tradition on the island, the issue of how to reconcile a direct and wholesale Near Eastern template for the glyptic, for the seal tradition, with an Egyptian template for writing, are questions that are posited but left unchallenged. How do we reconcile Near Eastern seal tradition with an Egyptian writing tradition as the sources? All this explains what has been, I think, accepted uncritically, namely the fact that the Minoans cannot have been responsible for inventions ex nihilo or almost ex nihilo, but must have adopted both traditions from elsewhere to varying degrees of indebtedness, whose measure we cannot infer. Tracing the origin of writing systems is problematic on account of two reasons. The first one is that we have to rely on the earliest attestations, dependent on the vagaries of archaeological excavation, rather than the first moments of writing or its very point of origin. The second problem concerns the degree of borrowing from a template to a new system. What elements were specifically transmitted? What level of phonographic innovation in the way that the structure of the sounds was restructured, was implemented? What dynamics of transmission were enacted? Even when a model script is identifiable with accuracy, the actual reconstruction of the activity of borrowing can still be fraught with problems concerning location, chronology, bilingualism, etc. The evidence of transmission of the linear A system for the development of linear B and the Phoenician template for the Greek alphabet are all cases in point. It's so difficult to reconstruct the transmission. The spectrum of possible levels of indebtedness to pre-existing models is broad, from stimulus or influence of one system or another to the reinvention prompted by the diffusion of incomplete information about the model system to, on the other side, the independent development in different cultures with similar conditions that induced the emergence of literacy. So, how indebted is Cretan hieroglyphic to a pre-existing writing system such as the Egyptian, assumed to be its template? The graphic parallels that Evans sought to strike between the two types of hieroglyphic systems, Egyptian and Cretan, cannot lead us far. As somebody else, that's not me, puts it bluntly, the shapes of the signs of Cretan have nothing to do with Egyptian signs. In grappling with this problem, Jean-Pierre Olivier suggests that the Cretans would have needed to borrow the day-to-day bureaucratic tool of the Egyptian archives, namely the hieratic system, rather than the monumental Egyptian hieroglyphic to be used on Crete for a parallel administrative function. However, the earliest instances of Cretan were not used in administration, but rather had a status-orientated character. And hieratic, too, does not share any graphic matches with Cretan. Even structurally, Egyptian hieroglyphic and hieratic are nowhere near the syllabic configuration that we assume to be the basis of Cretan. Egyptian writing is not syllabic, but logoconsonantal. This means that a core logographic element works with a system of phonographic consonants, basically, with no vowel notation. The systems could not be more different. Egyptian is riddled with a complex set of mixed elements. We need to add the determinatives to that strikes a stark contrast with the agile and nimble Cretan system. Chasing graphic parallels with other coeval scripts is an equally fruitless exercise, bound to fall prey to methodological circularity. That some Cretan signs may have Egyptian, Anatolian, or Syrian parallels, as has been suggested, can be, I think, as coincidental as subjective, and embracing scripts as the cumulative result of external influences from disparate sources is as speculative as accepting indirect borrowing from one single template. So if we cannot prove that the Cretan system was derivative and cannot reconstruct its paleographic source, should we be resigned to assume that a derivation by a vague and indirect stimulus diffusion would serve us better than any other explanation? The current view on the origin of early writing holds that what can be defined as incontrovertible primary inventions took place only 4 times in Sumer, China, Egypt, and Mesoamerica. These conclusions presuppose, by sheer absence of empirical evidence as to the contrary, that all other ancient writing systems must have represented secondary offshoots of these four inventions. This moves away, and we're quite fortunate that it does, from the monogenetic view, according to which writing was an original invention that took place only once in Sumer and was used as a template for all other scripts, including the Mesoamerican ones. That this common origin was fashionable still in recent times is to me rather surprising, and this enduring position may still prove quite an obstacle to assuming a more open-minded perspective on the possibility that writing may have been invented afresh more often than we are keen to admit. Proving independence of creation should not be a goal in itself, and I'm not trying to do that, as it would be going against a sound scientific methodology. However, it remains the case that a traditional diffusionist stance still imbues our perception of how writing came into being, and setting out to prove that the emergence of such a phenomenon was more indebted to autonomous stimuli and internal triggers than derivative and external ones is still a stone left to an extent unturned. Why, in other words, should ancient writing have been created from scratch so infrequently? Or even more pointedly, why should ancient writing have been invented only once, or alternatively 4 times, instead of, for instance, several times? What makes writing possible is the nexus linking the visual with the auditory perceptions. It is no coincidence that pictography is often the foundation for the initial bursts in the development of writing systems. Vision, in its iconicity, makes the development into symbol possible. This is the way that pictograms become logograms. From a cognitive standpoint, the belief is prevalent that there is an intrinsic difficulty in the human mind to put the above into practice, namely to conceptualize the relationship between image and word that will translate into a direct phonetic representation. This means, to simplify things, that the step by which the representation of a thing will become the representation of the word for that thing is cognitively difficult. As you can see on the left-hand side of the slide with lovesick, that is a verbalization process. And in turn, the process of shifting that meaning to a different word through rebus or pun or polysemy is equally difficult. And you can see an example of rebus on your right-hand side. For those of you that haven't worked it out, that's the solution. Sorry, I was looking for one that a rebus about Christmas, but I couldn't find it, so it have to do with Thanksgiving. So, is this really such an intellectual obstacle, the process of verbalizing and the process of turning that verbalization into a rebus, like shifting one meaning to another, really so difficult that the primitive human mind should have overcome so rarely? And what are the cognitive preconditions that help such process to happen? It appears that writing grew out of drawing. And while not all drawing must by necessity turn into writing, it is true that a pre-existing pictorial tradition as foundation for writing can point to independent creation. And the iconic origin of many scripts may suggest local roots. Cretan writing gives the impression of being embedded in iconographic display and symbolism, where the integration between art and writing suggests a predisposition to orderly representation that would be the forebear of writing. This has many ties with the non-inscribed glyptic seal tradition. In the case of Crete, it seems that writing may have been linked in some morphological logic with the pre-existing designs on the seals, but this needs to be studied much better. So the trigger that preceded the advent of writing could actually reside in the iconography of the seals, and by paving the way for translating symbols into writing, it marks the beginning of an autonomous development that follows local schemes and original expressions. But it is doubtful that writing on Crete may be the end result of an evolutionary process stemming from seal iconography. Writing is an invention, the result of a momentary occurrence that marks visibly the realization that a sign can stand for a word in case of logography, or a sound in case of phonography. It is, in other words, a punctual event, not a gradual process. The seal tradition that subsumes this invention is overall a system that works in parallel with it, but is quite separate. Therefore, there can be no doubt that the earliest instances of Cretan writing were resoundingly original, and whether or not the Cretan inventors knew of a template for writing, and I'm sure that they did, in the wider sense of a system for recording information indirectly through the combination of signs belonging to a specific repertoire, they did not adopt it as their model, not wholesale, and not even indirectly. There is also another structural clue that, while it may de facto not prove that Cretan hieroglyphic is mostly an autonomous creation, may at least function as further evidence that would support such an assumption. If, as argued above, the earliest instances of writing on Crete are to be taken as writing, real writing stricto sensu, their internal structure is essentially logosyllabic, with a limited use of logography. They're pretty much syllables. It is known from, again, cognitive psychology that an explicit awareness of syllables precedes phonemic awareness across languages. Non-literate individuals are readily able to syllabify words, in other words, so that they can break up words without difficulty into their constituent syllables, but are less able to single out syllables into the constituent phonemes. So we syllabify more easily than we actually use alphabets. This has to do with phonetic evolution. The model, developed by McNeilage, takes the proto-syllable, a single cycle in the repeated closed-open cycles of the mandible in a primate call, as the original unit. It is also the case that children learn through syllabification rather than phoneticism, whether in a syllabically simple language, such as Japanese, or in a syllabically varied language, such as English. This tendency is extremely common in modern languages, with the consonant plus vowel syllable being the universal syllable type. According to this form-content theory, the syllable, in other words, came first and was differentiated as the vocal organs came under voluntary control. Not surprisingly, then, invented writing systems tend to be syllabaries or logosyllabaries and not segmentally based alphabets. This, of course, does not make any logosyllabary an autonomous creation, or cannot advance incontrovertible evidence that Cretan was one such punctuated act of invention, but it certainly does not detract from the possibility that sometimes at the end of the 3rd millennium BC, the realization of the syllable unit as the basic cognitive principle was put to use on Cretan soil. When it comes to the origin of early writing, the first attestations in Mesopotamia have played a disproportionate role in understanding all other processes of ancient script creation. The idea of a monogenesis of writing that sees all other ancient writing systems than the Sumerian deriving directly or indirectly from it has also spilled onto the assumptions about the finality of writing in general. The Mesopotamian shadow cast on all writing is so long that the bookkeeping, the administrative function suggested by the earliest text, is taken as paradigm, as dogma, and as model for all other epigraphic traditions, so that writing and administration are flipped sides of the same coin, tying up the two faces of writing, its origin and function, within a purely technocratic administrative dimension. That the Mesopotamian case, in fact, represents the most stubbornly bureaucratic use of writing and should therefore be treated as weird, has not weakened the idea that all early writing is invented out of economic necessity. Cretan hieroglyphic has been included in the count, as all other Aegean systems of the Bronze Age. Are we actually entitled to claim this for all writing traditions, even if the evidence speaks differently? Some scholars actually believe so, on the claim that what is extant are status-orientated, prestige-laden objects, such as the earliest Chinese examples you can see on this slide, that carry inscriptions made with durable material, as opposed to the more mundane day-to-day administrative documents written in papyrus or wood that are now lost, or have been swallowed by the administrative uber-explanation. To tie the multiple creations of writing to one purpose only fosters, I think, an oversimplification that dodges complexities of specific context and also levels up diverse cultural triggers at play when writing is created. Not only does early writing predate the emergence of the bureaucratic, heavy, centralized state, but its first application in several regions often seem to be concerned with more general needs to name things and people. This onomastic theory, should be called that actually, this onomastic theory needs to be explored further. Not because of any urgency to substitute the technocratic administrative model, but because it fits, without silences, some of the extant evidence for the inception of writing in several cultures. In such contexts, the particular interests of individuals that are intent in making specific statements of identity and group affiliation are emphasized through marks of ownership or through the recording of personal names, and examples are plentiful. Archaic Greece records an almost obsessive interest in such display, which went hand in hand with emphasizing a prerogative of knowledge over the illiterate. All Germanic runes were used to personalize various objects with names and formulas. Etruria displayed literacy as a preserve of the elite, and inscriptions represented arenas where ideological manipulation could be enacted through the formulaic character of the text. And its dual mode of communicating with peers and at the same time distancing the rest builds up this picture that at one level the inscription may name individuals, and at another level they represent the power of the community of which they are part. The situated context, I put in some Cypreminon as well, but I don't want to talk about Cypreminon at all. The situated context of Cretan hieroglyphic plays out along the same lines. Despite the evidence for its later use in palatial economies, the emergence of writing on Crete may not have been linked to an identifiable and incontrovertible economic urgency, but may have resided more in the symbolic value attached to the seal stones, such as those found at the cemetery of ARCHANES-PHOURNOI, which were deposited in high-status burials, whose social importance was emphasized by the presence of such objects. Even at a later date, hieroglyphic seal stones may have served a double function of administrative tools as well as mini monuments of status, reflecting the elite affiliation of selected individuals whose intention was to mark ownership and identity through, if my analysis is correct, the signature stamping of these precious items. That these instruments were later co-opted by the bureaucracy should not suffocate the symbolic value attached to them as physical objects. Also, the fact that the early stages of writing are linked to groups at ARCHANES-PHOURNOI that predate the inception of the palatial structure suggests that writing was not born out of a necessity to manage a macroeconomy, but was the result of elite group efforts that sought to establish their position in life and in death by making specific statements about themselves. Understanding all this is significant not only for the Cretan microcosm, but also as a contribution to the discourse on the origins of writing in much more general terms. To this end, I have two considerations that spring to my mind. There is no reason why we should be looking for a common context for the invention of writing, or seek an umbrella explanation. And even if there were, we would not find a convincing one, I think, in the purely economic motivations. Nor is there a reason to justify the social and economic investment required to propagate and maintain a writing system. Writing may be the result of less concerted efforts than we would like to admit, and may be less conditioned and influenced by external elements or imperious internal needs than we actually wish to accept. Perhaps it may constitute in all regions and periods a somewhat localized, self-contained, and even intimate process of creation. So, to wrap this up very concisely, three concerns have been articulated in this contribution: to establish a definition of the earliest writing on Crete, place it in its situated context of use, and seek origin and reasons behind its introduction. The method of investigation that I've chosen to adopt has relied much less on diffusion-imbued mechanistic derivations and technocratic explanations, and makes space for a more sophisticated degree of creative input to be involved in the instance of script origination on Crete. This concluding synthesis is very brief to prove that, similarly to what the short inscriptions on of the Cretan siltstones aim to do, a lot of information can be packed in very tiny little space. Thank you.